All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us in our URI College of the Environment and Life Sciences Cooperative Extension Learn at Home webinar series. My name is Sejal Lannerman, and I am the Community Engagement and Outreach Coordinator for URI Cooperative Extension. Today, we're very excited and thrilled to have one of our most popular presenters back, Dr. Bridget Ruemmele. She'll be talking on tree fruits for Rhode Island. She previously gave us one on small fruits for Rhode Island and also lawns. So if you missed those, you can always go back and watch them on our official URI YouTube channel. Please advance to the next slide. We'll get started with this talk after just a couple of messages here. So Cooperative Extension is the land grant for the University of Rhode Island, and we are charged with bringing the research and the knowledge and science to the community. And we do that in a number of ways, and we basically organize ourselves into our different strategic areas of focus, which are land stewardship, food systems and agriculture, water resources, energy efficiency, conservation and renewables, and also healthy lifestyles. If you want to learn more about those or the different programs that fall underneath each one of those focus areas, I urge you to visit coopex.uri.edu to learn a little bit more. Okay, next slide. So here are some of our guiding principles. Just pause this for 1 second here. So our guiding principles here at Cooperative Extension is dedicated to Rhode Island, the people and their communities. We are committing to improving your life, your livelihood, and of course, the health of our natural environment. We also believe in social justice, and collectively, we strive to deepen our cultural understanding and proficiency while building capacity to create inclusive experiences to address diverse stakeholder needs. And I'm very proud that we didn't have to halt everything that we were doing because of the pandemic that we're currently in. We have been offering this Learn at Home webinar series. And of course, as I mentioned before, we have them recorded. So if you missed any of them and want to go back, they're always available. Okay, next slide. Just a few housekeeping notes before we get started. We would so appreciate if you could take a few minutes to complete a very brief survey that we're going to send to you in a follow-up email. We honestly do read every single one of them, and a lot of them has helped shape and changed how we're offering these series, what time we offer them at, when, what's working, what's not working. So please just take a minute to do that so we can get better at what we're doing. And I've mentioned this several times about our YouTube channel, but also know that they are in closed captioned so that you don't have to listen to them with the audio on. Okay, so I'm very excited to introduce Dr. Bridget Ruemmele. Dr. Bridget Ruemmele earned her master's and her PhD degrees in horticulture from the University of Minnesota. Since 1991, she has been a professor in the plant sciences department here at URI, conducting research, extension, and teaching of various horticultural crops, including fruit culture. So I invite you to welcome Dr. Bridget Ruemmele.
Thanks, Rob. So today we're going to talk about tree fruits, and we're going to primarily concentrate on the ones that you could grow in Rhode Island, with some caveats with some of them. And the ones I'm going to address primarily are apples, pears, peaches, apricots, plums, and cherries. If you have additional questions after this presentation is over, there is a New England Tree Fruit Management Guide that is now completely online. It is available through every New England State's Cooperative Extension website. Although it is geared toward commercial growers, there's a lot of useful information relative to general growing fruit trees wherever, whether it's in a commercial orchard or your backyard. The New England Tree Fruit Management Guide covers the following topics: integrated pest management, which I'll talk a little bit about when we get to talking about pests. And it also breaks down the categories into apples and pears, and then the stone fruits. Stone fruits are fruits that have pits. So that's the peaches and apricots and plums and cherries. Additional topics that are kind of geared more toward the commercial grower are about weed management and applying pesticides and dealing with wildlife and growing organic crops. Another place that you might want to look at that's also directed mainly to commercial growers, but does have useful information that homeowners can use as well, is the Orchard Best Management Practices. And that is a handbook, and I believe you can download it or you can buy it. So we're going to concentrate on the fruits that I mentioned, and they all happen to be in the rose family or the Rosaceae family. So all of these tree fruits we're talking about today are actually somewhat related to each other. Looking at the breakdown of how these fruits are related to each other, apples and pears are more closely related to each other than they are to the other species. In the Prunus genus, that's the stone fruits. And that includes the peaches, the apricots, a couple kinds of plums, and both sweet and sour cherry. Also interesting to note is that almonds are actually fairly closely related to peaches, even though I'm not really going to talk about them today. Previously, I talked about small fruits, and of the small fruits, some of those are also in the Rosaceae family, the strawberries and the brambles, the blackberry and the raspberries. So apples, their scientific name, if you want to be technical, is Malus domestica. And although we talk about things being as American as apple pie, apples themselves are not native to the United States. They were brought over from, they believe, mainly originally Kazakhstan, but they came over with the people from Europe. And the state apple is actually the Rhode Island greening apple, which is pictured here. And it's actually, I believe, also the state fruit. There are two species of pears. We primarily grow Pyrus communis or European pear here in the Northeast. The Asian pear, which is sort of like, it seems like a cross between an apple and a pear, is becoming more popular here, but I don't know that a lot of people are growing it here. The big issue with growing pears in New England is we have a humid climate that may promote a bacterial infection known as fire blight. And when you've got the fire blight, it can do damage to your trees and literally result in what looks like a burnt appearance to the tips of your twigs and branches. And because it's a bacterial infection, you really can't treat it. And so you need to get rid of the diseased material. Okay, come on. There we go. A little bit on pears for those who like trivia or more details. Those gritty cells that you taste when you are eating a pear, their technical name is brachysclerids, if you want to try and impress people. And a caveat with pears relative to apples is that they do bloom earlier than apples, so they may be susceptible to frost damage. That being said, if the frost isn't really heavy, it may actually help to thin out the blossoms so that you end up getting bigger pears. It's just if we get a really late frost and kills all the blossoms that we might run into trouble. Another issue with pears is sometimes the way the branches meet up with the main stem, they often sometimes have a fairly narrow angle or crotch, and you may need to actually use some wooden braces to push apart that branch so that there's better spread of the tree and it's a more open tree to get better light throughout the canopy of the tree. Now, peaches are in the Prunus genus, the stone fruits. And peaches, the species name is persica, so peaches are Prunus persica. But both peaches and nectarines are the same genus and species. Nectarines are just fuzzless peaches. They are not a separate, distinct species. So if you've been thinking that nectarines are way different than peaches, they actually are not that much different from each other. In fact, they're so genetically similar that they are the same species. In the commercial and homeowner industry, there are two kinds of peaches. There's the freestone and the clingstone. In the commercial market, where they have processing facilities, they primarily grow clingstone peaches because they hold their shape better in the canning process. but for ease of removing that pit from the peach, in the public market, most of the peaches that you will be buying will be the freestone type, where it's very easy to remove the fleshy tissue that you want to eat from that nice hard pit that surrounds the seed. In the case of plums, there are two main species, the European plums, Prunus domestica on the left, and the Japanese plum or Prunus salicina on the right. The European plum is the one that's primarily used for making prunes, or as more euphemistically called these days, dried plums, since prunes have gotten such a bad rap in some places. The Japanese plums are the ones that are primarily used for fresh eating, and they come in a variety of shapes and colors, both internally and externally, and there's even hybrids among them. Now, relative to comparing European to Japanese plums, European plums have a similar cold hardiness to apples and pears, so they're a little bit better adapted to our climate than the Japanese pears. The Japanese pears blooms later, or the European blooms later, so you have less chance of frost damage. Now, the Japanese plum has more of a cold hardiness similar to peach. And if you've tried to grow peaches in New England, some years you're successful and some years you're not as successful if it's not in a protected site. A few years ago, the URI peach trees suffered a very late frost and we got 0 peaches off of those trees. So the same thing could happen with Japanese plums in a really late frost occurring year. Another difference between Japanese and European plums is the amount of flowering. The European plum on the left does not flower nearly as much as the Japanese plum on the right. As a result, if you're growing Japanese plums and you want to get larger fruits, you may have to go in and thin out some of the flowers or some of the small fruitlets as they're first starting to develop. With the European plums, they're spaced further apart and you may not have to do as much removal of excess blooms. Apricots, which are actually very closely related to plums, so closely related they can be hybridized, but the apricot is Prunus armeniaca, and this is a fruit that is borne mostly on spurs. Some of them are borne on lateral branches, and those are two terms I'll talk about later on when I'm talking about pruning. Just like with the Japanese plum, apricots may be a little bit frost sensitive. So if you do decide to grow apricots, you may want to grow them in a more protected location. Now, there are some plum apricot hybrids you may want to try out. A cross between a plum and an apricot produces a plumcot that's 50% plum and 50% apricot as far as its genetics are concerned. And it gives you a color that's sort of a little plum colored and a little apricot colored. If you take that plumcot and you cross it back to an apricot, you get something called an aprium. And so it's mostly like an apricot with a little bit of plum going on. The most popular hybrid is the pluot, and that's where they take a plumcot and cross it back to a plum. And so it's mostly plum with a little bit of apricot thrown in. And the pluots are the only ones I've ever seen for sale in grocery stores, but all 3 of those hybrids, you can buy trees of them to grow your own if you want to try them. Now, when people think about cherries, they often think, well, sour cherries are just cherries that you pick before they're fully ripe. But that's not actually the case. They are actually different species. Sweet cherries are Prunus avium, and sour or pie cherries are Prunus cerasus. The sour cherry is more tolerant of our humid conditions, and so it would be easier to grow in our environment. Sweet cherries are susceptible to fire blight, which is that bacterial disease that is a problem in more humid climates, to the point where commercially sweet cherries are grown out west where there's less humidity to run into problems with the fire blight. The main state that grows sour cherries is actually Michigan, which has somewhat of a climate similar to ours. Now, generally, growing tree fruits, you can either grow a full-size tree or standard tree, or you may buy a shorter tree that's been grafted to a rootstock to shorten them, or what we call dwarf them. Dwarfed trees often produce abundant fruit, but because they don't have as strong as stems or roots, it's often a good idea to provide extra support for them to keep their branches from breaking off when they become laden with the fruit. Either the standard or the dwarf trees are easily incorporated into landscape, and I'll show you a couple options you may try to make them fancier than just your basic tree shape. So, like most plants, tree fruits generally require full sun, or at least 6 to 8 hours of sun each day. If they have too much shade, that can in fact impact their growth negatively. It can reduce their fruiting potential, also reduce the fruiting quality. Even the color of the fruit is affected by too little sun, and the plants may not be as cold hardy as they would be if they were in the full sun. So, try and choose the most exposed area of your property. And if there are nearby trees, consider removing or pruning any shading trees that will allow for improved sun exposure. Relative to soils, we don't have the best soils in Rhode Island, unfortunately. Most fruit crops grow best on deep, well-drained, what we call loamy soils, and close to a pH of slightly acid to neutral. 7 is a neutral pH where it's not too acid, not too basic. And a loamy type soil has a mixture of sand and clay, as well as a third soil particle type called silt. And it combines the best of what sand offers and the best of what clay offers. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of good deep soils in New England, so modifying your soil may be useful if you decide to plant fruit trees. You should do a soil test at least every 3 years for fertility and also checking the pH. We tend to run on the acid side of pHs here in New England, especially Rhode Island, and so you may need to add lime to increase the pH. A soil test will help you know whether or not that's the case. It also can tell you how much organic matter you have in your soil, so you can decide whether you might need to add some more of that as well as any upgrade of fertilizer that might be lacking. Now, most fruit trees are grafted, and that's to ensure that you get the cultivars or varieties that you are expecting to get. If you plant a fruit tree from seed, of the ones I'm talking about anyway, you may not get the fruit that's anything like the fruit that you thought you were going to get. The plant pictured here is actually a tree that's been grafted with multiple varieties of stone fruits. And I believe they got over 20 varieties in there, including multiple species. That would make quite an interesting addition to your landscape, but because of the multitude of grafts, it would be probably prohibitively expensive unless you did it yourself. So what is grafting? Grafting is where you take the desirable cultivar and you take either a stem piece of young wood or even as little as a single bud, and you cut the end at an angle and you make that angled end match a rootstock that's also been cut to a complementary angle. What you want to do is join up those two pieces. The top part, the desirable cultivar, is called the scion, and the bottom part is called the rootstock. And what you want to do is match up the vascular system. That's the parts of the plant that move the water and food, because you need a continuous movement of water and food from the roots up to the leaves and back down to the roots. So the desirable cultivar is attached to a rootstock that's been selected to either improve or modify the growth. And in the case of many of our fruit trees, it's often to make them shorter or more dwarfed. But they may also have additional benefits of certain disease resistances or possibly even resistances to microscopic worms like nematodes. When you buy fruit trees, you can either buy them bare root, where they've been dug up out of the ground where they've been grown, and they are shipped dormant. Dormant plants should be planted immediately rather than trying to stockpile them. You can also buy trees as potted plants. It's also preferred that you plant them while they're dormant. You're going to find that potted trees will have many more fine roots than the bare root trees. In the process of digging up that bare root tree that you see pictured here, most of those fine roots will be broken off. So the potted plant will look like it's got a lot more roots, but both trees can be successfully grown. Where to get your material? Preferably a local nursery. They will stock trees that do well where you live, whether it's Rhode Island or if you happen to be tuning in from some other part of the country. If you happen to try and buy online, you want to look for plants that tolerate your cold hardiness zone. And in Rhode Island, we are in zone 6. When you plant your tree, you use basic planting techniques. You want to make a hole that's deeper than the roots, preferably. You might want to modify that hole with some soil amendments. And when you plant the tree, you should plant it so it's at the same level where it was, whether it was in the soil before it was dug up as a bare root or when it was in the pot. The main thing is to make sure that that graft union is above the soil line. Any buds that grow from below that graft union will not be your desired cultivar, and they should be removed and not allowed to continue growth. Only allow the stems that are above the graft union to grow if you want to have plants that produce the fruits that you like. Another thing to consider in selecting plants is their length of time in growth. This happens to show some of the more common apple cultivars. It's not quite up to date for some of the newer ones that have been coming out, but the later the apple to be mature, the more likely you're going to run into trouble possibly getting a crop. So you're going to want to aim for ones that are a little bit earlier in the fall, probably September and October, although you could aim for something earlier if you really want apples earlier and you happen to like those cultivars. Once you've got your plants established, you should consider irrigation. And if you do consider irrigation, drip irrigation is preferable so that you don't get the leaves and the stems excessively wet. Excessive moisture on the above ground parts of the plant help to promote disease incidence, and we want to avoid any kind of fungal growth in particular. Now, all of these fruit trees require chilling hours in order to produce fruit. Those refer to hours when there must be below a certain temperature in order for those plants to be able to produce flowers and fruit the next year. And the number of chilling hours will vary by species as well as varieties within species. So you want to get one that's adapted to our relative amount of chilling hours. We aren't the coldest by any means, but you want probably in the range of about 1,000 hours of chilling. If the plants don't get enough chilling hours in the winter, or if they get too much chilling hours in the winter, there may be problems with fruit production the following year. So it's best to try and get close to the chilling hour that's most likely for your area. Pruning is essential for fruit trees, as it is with other trees, and pruning is primarily done during dormancy, when the plant is not actively growing. Pruning is done for a number of reasons. It's to encourage fruit development, and we're going to talk a little bit more about where the fruit grows specifically on the trees. It's also to remove any diseased or damaged wood, and if there's any overlapping wood that is causing too much shading, you may want to thin out some of the branches as well. Any wood that you remove through pruning should be destroyed so that it does not harbor any potential disease pathogens or even insects. Now, pruning cuts can be broken down into two basic kinds of cuts. If you cut off a branch partway back to where it's attached to the rest of the plant, that's called heading back. And when you do a heading back cut, you're going to stimulate growth just below the cut. So you will promote growth along this part of the branch. Thinning out is when you've got too dense of a canopy, too much leaf matter shading out your fruit. And that's where you cut a branch all the way back to where it's attached to the main stem. And what happens then is regrowth is stimulated throughout the entire tree rather than just at that point. So each one of these cuts has a purpose depending upon what you're trying to promote. When you first establish your tree, there's something called a training system. And fruit trees are usually trained to one of two kinds of training systems, although there are many, many modifications. In the central leader system on the left, you're basically training that tree to grow essentially like a Christmas tree, where the lower branches extend out further than the upper branches. And you have a central stem with the growing point that goes all the way to the top of the tree. In the open center or vase system, you start out similar to the other tree, but then you select at one point on the stem where all the branches will be allowed to remain. It's usually 4 branches. And then you cut out that main stem. So the growing point is not way at the top of the plant. You've removed that top growing point. And different tree fruits respond to these two different training systems differently. In the case of the central leader system, apples, pears, and sweet cherries do well when they're trained to this system. With the open center system, peaches, plums, apricots, and sour cherries grow best. They need that more open canopy to allow for good light penetration to get the best fruit growth. Now, if you want to go off the charts and go beyond just the basic open center and vase shape, you can try different methods that fall under a category called espalier. And here's one where they actually have 2 trees growing adjacent to each other, and then one canopy is directed to the left and one is directed to the right, and sort of gives you a border effect. A more popular espalier type, or what most people associate with espalier, is the one that's called the candelabra, where you actually use stakes to train the branches to grow horizontally and then upward in a candelabra-like appearance. And you may have it close to a building or you may have it out in the open, and then the fruit grows on various parts of the tree. Another kind that I think is kind of fascinating is if you have several trees and you want to make sort of a hedge border, but you want to get fruit from your trees instead of just having a plain hedge that doesn't give you any edible fruit, is this crisscross pattern where you actually have branches from one tree crossing over with another tree, as well as within the tree itself. It takes a little bit of work, and you can see that there are wires to help support these trees because they're dwarf trees, but it does give quite a very attractive effect if you are into a little bit of extra work. Another system is called the Spanish bush, and I include it just to show you that during the training process, the plants may not look all that attractive, but once it's done, it does appear attractive. And with the Spanish bush, what you're doing is you're emphasizing a lot of short growth all toward the top, and that's where most of your fruit will be. This slide I included just to show you different kinds of pruning cuts and why different pruning cuts are made. In the case of side branches are called scaffolds. And so when you're developing scaffolds, you want them to have a nice wide angle. If they have a weak angle, we call it a weak crotch. If you happen to have stems that grow back beyond where you don't want them to grow, you may cut them off. They call them water sprouts. Anything below your bud graft or union is called a sucker. And those suckers are ones that you do not want to allow to remain because they will not be your desired variety. So fruits are produced basically at nearly the same points in the canopy every year. You need good light exposure throughout the canopy because if the spurs are too shaded, they may actually not form flower buds the next year. So fruits in the tree fruit category generally fall into primarily spur bearing or primarily lateral bearing. Spur bearing fruits, the fruit is borne mostly on very short, slow growing lateral branches that you almost think are just tiny little twigs, but this spur is actually several years old. And spurs develop on 2-year-old wood and older wood, and they grow very slowly, maybe only about 1/4 inch a year. Apples, pears, plums, apricots, and sweet cherries grow primarily on spurs, although you will get some fruit on laterals. But when you're pruning these particular fruits, you want to be careful not to knock off the spurs because they will be your primary areas of fruit production. So here's an example showing pruning a lateral branch on a spur-bearing apple tree and what you remove and what you don't remove. And I will let you look at that more closely when you go back through this on your own, if hopefully you do that. Basically, you cut back branches to encourage spurs to form, and any vigorous growth you remove. One thing that's not mentioned on this slide is spacing. You want to space your spurs about 4 to 6 inches apart for apples and pears. They can be a little bit closer for plums, but the bigger spacing allows you to get bigger fruits. Now, lateral bearing species produce fruit mainly from lateral buds that's on 1-year-old wood. So because that wood has to be fairly young, you have to stimulate ample growth every year with your dormant pruning and also proper fertilizing in order to get enough fruiting shoots for the next year. So pruning is a little bit more critical to be done on a regular basis with lateral bearing species. And that includes the peaches and sour cherries, although sour cherries will also produce fruit on spurs. You may get some spurs on peaches, but they will primarily be on lateral branches. So pruning a lateral branch, you may allow some spurs to exist, but you also keep the long laterals so that you get the long 1-year-old wood. This is where most of your fruit will occur on the trees that produce fruit mostly on lateral wood. Now, summer pruning is not recommended unless there's a specific reason. Some fruit trees may produce so much vegetation that there's too much shading going on. And so if you need to open up the canopy, that may be something you can do. If you have a storm that causes damage to your tree, or you find some diseased wood, especially if it's a bacterial or viral infection, you want to remove that diseased material as soon as possible and destroy it. If you do any pruning during the growing season, do it during the summer. If you do it too late into the fall, you actually can encourage some new growth that may not be cold hardy enough. Some fruit trees require different varieties for cross-pollination in order to optimize your fruit production. In those cases, you need to select 2 unrelated varieties that pollinate at roughly the same time, so that one provides the pollen for the other and vice versa. So, relative to pollination and cross-pollination, apples, pears, sweet cherries, Japanese plums, as well as some apricots and some European plums will produce the most fruit when you have them cross-pollinated. So you should have 2 different varieties of these to have your best success. In the case of apples, if there's a crabapple in the neighborhood, or if you have a crabapple, that can serve as the pollen source for the apples. For peaches and sour cherries, they don't require cross-pollination, so you can get by with just a single variety and get good fruit production. There are various charts available to show you which varieties to select, or if you buy it from a nursery, they should be able to tell you which ones will be best to pollinate each other. The graph on the left, or chart on the left actually, any darkened spaces are ones where you should not combine those particular varieties with each other because they're too genetically similar. The chart on the right shows blooming periods, so you can select plants that have similar bloom time because they should be able to pollinate each other. If you pick one that's got an early bloom and one that's got a late bloom, they may not end up pollinating each other, and then you may not get as much fruit as you were hoping. Now, some of our bigger fruits, like especially the peaches and the pears and the apples, may produce so many flowers close together that you might consider doing some thinning of either the flowers or the small fruits when they're first developing. This happens to be a nectarine, and every orange asterisk is showing a tiny fruitlet that's starting to develop. And if all of these were allowed to remain on that lateral branch, you would end up with much smaller peaches. So you can go in and actually lop off some of the fruits, and afterwards they left just 2 fruitlets there to develop into full-size peaches, or nectarines in this case. Lastly, I'll talk a little bit about fruit pests. Each type of fruit may be affected by plant pests, and you should always apply principles of integrated pest management to help maintain fruit quantity as well as fruit quality. We do encourage minimizing pesticide use. The booklets that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk do have more information on pest management and integrated pest management than I have time here. I'll concentrate on one example of what kind of options you have, and then I'll show you some of the different plant pests to be on the lookout for. So integrated pest management, sometimes I call it integrated plant management because really managing the whole plant can help reduce their susceptibility to pests. But regardless, integrated means you use multiple practices. Pests could be anything from animals to weeds to diseases. And the animals can be anything from the tiniest insect all the way up to deer, which we all know deer love to eat fruit. And management refers to managing the risk and keeping the damage to acceptable levels, deciding when it's the best time to start a treatment or whether you even need to do a treatment in order to have a decent enough crop. In the case of homeowners, you're probably going to be willing to accept a little bit less perfection than on a commercial basis, because some fruit, even if it's got a little bit of damage, is often still edible. So on a commercial level, they have this chart to follow. As a homeowner, you may decide to do some trapping and sampling and figuring out what pests are on the horizon. There may be plants that have resistance genetically. There may be biological controls, cultural controls. Sanitation is a big cultural control with fruit trees. Remove any diseased material that's on the ground. It serves as a source for future infestations. And preferably chemical controls as a last resort, at least at the homeowner level. What you're looking for is basically environmental sustainability as a homeowner. The commercial grower would also look at the economic impact as well. So one of the big pests that's first came to our country on the West Coast, but is now spread across the country and is affecting several tree fruits as well as many of our small fruits, is the spotted winged Drosophila. It's a little fly, basically, and it can affect several of our tree fruits. The female on the left has this structure called an ovipositor that it uses to inject its eggs into whatever part of the plant it's depositing the eggs, including your fruit. So for homeowners, the best thing is sanitation. Keep as much material that could potentially be a host for these Drosophila away from them. With small fruits, sometimes they can use netting for exclusion. It would be more difficult with trees, although with a dwarf tree, it might be worth it. What you want to do is pick the fruit as soon as it is ripe, and you want to clean up and dispose any overripe or rotted fruit that you didn't pick. Don't let it lay on the ground and serve as a source for developing larvae. With the fruit that you harvest, you should can or freeze it as soon as possible. That will kill any larvae or eggs in the fruit. And I know that sounds gross that, oh my God, there might be larvae or eggs in the fruit, but they're dead, so they won't harm you. And any fruit waste, that includes the peels, anything that you haven't preserved, should be disposed of properly. Small quantities, you can bag them up tightly sealed and put them in the trash, or you could freeze them and kill the insects and eggs and larvae that way before you dispose of it. If you put the waste into clear bags and set it in a sunny location for 72 hours, that should be enough to kill any of the larvae or eggs or adults. If you have large quantities of fruit waste, say you've got your own little miniature orchard out back, you should bury it to at least a depth of at least 10 inches, so anything will not be able to emerge from the ground. If you decide to compost the waste, it's suggested you use 1 part of poultry manure to 3 parts of your waste. And if you don't use the poultry manure, it won't compost properly enough to ensure that you kill all of the spotted Drosophila fly, spotted winged Drosophila. Now, some of the other pests you might want to watch out for and what they might cause. There's the codling moth. It occurs in apples, pears, and plums, and it will result in feeding in your fruit. And you see those lovely larvae that you really don't want to see half of one when you bite into an apple, because the other half is probably already in your mouth. And if it happens early enough in the life cycle, the fruit may actually drop before it's fully mature. Recommendations should be followed in the guidebooks that I indicated at the beginning of this presentation. The oriental fruit moth is another one that is seen on a number of our Rosaceae fruits. It results in dieback of the shoots, and the larvae will feed on the fruits, and they may actually cause the fruit to drop. So it's primarily the larvae that cause the damage, but it's the adults that will lay the eggs that become the larvae. Peach plum curculio is a kind of weevil. Weevils have these little snouts that are curved, and they can occur on more than just plums. They can occur on many of the stone fruits. They even can occur in some of the smaller fruits like blueberry. And what you'll find is you'll have some scarring, cat facing, which basically it looks like little craters in your fruit, and the larvae will feed on the fruit and cause the fruit to drop. Scales occur on most fruit crops. They're very, very tiny insects. They cause a lot of cosmetic damage, but they may also cause limb and twig dieback. They may also result in honeydew being secreted, and the honeydew will promote growth of a sooty mold or disease. Stink bugs and plant bugs also attack most fruit crops, and they will cause damage to the fruit, making it very undesirable in appearance. Aphids are another tiny insect, and they also can occur on most fruit crops. They do feed on the leaves and the shoots, but they can cause damage on the fruits as well. And like with the scales, they can produce a honeydew that can lead to sooty mold development. These tiny insects also are prime transmitters of viruses, and viruses are not able to be cured. So although the aphid may not do a lot of damage in appearance, it may transmit a virus that may lead to ultimately death of your tree. Mites are related to spiders. They also occur on most fruit crops. They will feed on leaves. They will cause stippling, which is a spotting appearance of little tiny dots. And you may even see webs at the shoot tips. This happens to be a picture here on the right of an apple tree that's really been heavily infested by spider mites. And you can even see that the fruit does not look appealing. Powdery mildew, it looks like somebody dropped talcum powder all over your plant. It occurs on apples, peaches, and plums. You may get some brown, streaky, russeting, sort of looks like little scabby streaks on your fruit, or the fruit may be discolored. The leaves are often distorted and they may have a powdery white appearance because of the spore masses that can occur on both sides of the leaves. And those spores can be moved by wind very easily. Another disease caused by a fungus is apple, peach, and pear, or leaf spots or scabs that occurs on apple, peach, and pear. I'm trying to get ahead of myself. And it causes unsightly blemishes on both the fruit and the leaves. And you may get blotches like you see in that picture if it's severe enough, which on a commercial basis would make that fruit not saleable. Now, on the stone fruits, brown rot can be a serious issue. It occurs on peaches, apricots, plums, and cherries. If it happens during the blossom phase, like in this lower picture, it can kill the flowers during bloom, and then you've got very little fruit. When the fruit has developed, it can also attack the fruit, and then you get these brown soft spots, and then they get these tan powdery spores, and those spores can spread from fruit to fruit and tree to tree very readily. So brown rot is something you want to be very careful to watch out for. And not just above ground, but fungi can attack below the ground. This happens to be ARMILLARIA root rot, and that's growth of that fungal growth on the roots below ground. It occurs on pretty much all of the tree fruits. And what happens is it looks like the above ground part of your tree is wilting or declining, but you really can't find anything on the tree itself. And you have to dig up the root to find out that the cause is happening below the ground. Stem canker is another disease that can be caused by a fungus. It's variable. Basically what happens is it can weaken limbs and cause them to break off. And the plant may try and form a callus tissue at the margins to try and recover, but if the canker is severe enough, it may not allow that limb to remain on the plant. Vascular wilt is another fungal problem. It occurs on mostly the stone fruits, the peaches, plums, apricots, and cherries. What happens is the leaves wilt, they become chlorotic or turn brown. Chlorotic means they turn yellowish. And you often start to see a shoot die back, especially if it's affecting one side of the tree first. If you cut into a branch, that tissue that moves the water and the nutrients may appear yellow, red, or brown, because that's where that fungus is growing and it's preventing the movement of water throughout that plant. Now, bacteria cause a number of problems. One example is bacterial canker. There is no really good treatment recommended for bacteria or viral infections. Your best bet is to remove any infected material. This particular example is bacterial canker, occurs primarily on the stone fruits, and you'll see some irregular sunken areas in the bark, and the tissue beneath these cankers is often discolored and sour smelling. That's something characteristic of bacteria, more so than the fungi, is that sour smell. And the top part, the scion part of the tree, may actually die back, but if it does not attack the rootstock, you may end up with some sprouts of trees below the root graft union, and those will not produce your desirable fruit. So at that point, you're better off removing the tree. Fire blight is the bacterial disease I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. It occurs a lot on our tree fruits in our humid climate. And what happens is you get a browning or blackening and withering of flower clusters. You also get the shoots, especially the younger shoots, that appear to be dark, and they sort of curl in what we call a shepherd's crook appearance. And if it attacks severely enough, it can kill entire limbs or trees. If you find fire blight, it should be removed as soon as possible if you want to save the tree. And if it's gone beyond that point, you may have to remove the tree itself. Viruses have no cure. There are a few of them. This one example I show you is the plum pox virus that occurs on more than just plums. It occurs on a lot of the stone fruits. What you see is a mosaic yellowing of the leaves or unusual spotting patterns. And you may find that the leaves and shoots twist and torn in contorted shapes. The only treatment you can do with viruses that have invaded a plant is to remove the infected plants, because they can be spread by certain insects from tree to tree. If you want to learn more about sustainable fruit care, we do have a national site at www.attra.ncat.org that talks about a lot of plants, not just the tree fruits. You can find information about other plants there as well. So with that brief introduction to tree fruits, I will turn it back over to Sejal.
I know I've got a tricky name there. That was excellent. Thank you so much. My son, who's next to me now, has no excuses for liking peaches and not nectarines. So I just, we're going to get to a couple questions and answers. The timing was perfect, so I believe we have a little bit of time for that. But just a reminder, we are accepting enrollment for our URI Master Gardener program. So just a little information there. All of this, of course, can always be found by quickly Googling URI Cooperative Extension as well. Next slide, please. And then also, you know, there were some really great questions that came into the chat. For any questions that we're not able to answer, or you have questions moving forward, urge you to check out our gardening resources and utilize our gardening and environmental hotline. So if you have a question, a gardening question, environmental question, and you even have pictures to go with it, you can email those to gardner@uri.edu, and someone will get back to you. We have these Learn at Home webinars. Right now, I think we're continuing to do them every Tuesday. So be on the lookout for that. We post them on Facebook and on our main URI site. So with that said, let's just take a few minutes, Bridget. We had some great questions that came in, some of which I think I was able to answer pretty confidently. But we had one from Kristen that said she received some small bare root fruit trees. They were plums and cherries, less than a foot tall, but the area won't be ready for planting until about spring 2021, so next year. She said she's planning to put them in containers until then. Any advice for overwintering and that location and care?
For overwintering, they do need a cold period, but I would protect the roots. What she may want to do is put them in a dark, cool place if she has one. They do need chilling temperatures. Generally, usually the guideline is usually about 47 degrees or lower for chilling temperatures. Although at this point, because they're so young, you're not as much concerned about the fruit development as you are with just the tree being adequately maintained. So yes, if she puts them in a pot of soil, I would not just leave them bare root. They probably wouldn't survive.
Okay, great. The next one is any information on native fruit tree varieties like pawpaws or persimmons. She's heard that these native fruits are a little bit more disease resistant, and she's curious about them.
It's very interesting that there is some work going on in some places. Actually, the pawpaw that you mentioned, one of my former colleagues, he was an undergraduate when I was a graduate student, actually, but he's now the director at I think Western Kentucky or Kentucky State University, and he has a major pawpaw breeding program and research program. So if you want information on pawpaws, I would check the Kentucky site because they will have a lot of information about that. There are some various extension sites that do deal with some of these more less common native fruits, but I've not dealt with many of them personally.
Okay, great.
They
So
should be actually more disease tolerant because they are adapted to being here.
right, that's right. And if anybody wants to get their hands on a pawpaw, I believe there's a grower in Warwick. There's not a lot of them. They don't have a long storage life, and they are one of the most delicious things I've ever had. If you like mangoes and some of those tropical fruits, your mind will be blown that we can grow those here in Rhode Island. So they're usually ready in about, I want to say September-ish, I think pawpaws are ready. Yep. Okay. So just one or two more. Let's see. Monica has planted 2 apple trees in early spring, and she just noticed that they have some rust spots on the young leaves. She looked it up, and she feels confident that it's a fungal disease. She applied neem oil just this morning. Is there anything else that you would recommend?
Rusts usually aren't a real severe fungal problem in most plants. As long as it's not on the fruit and she's not seeing a lot of it, she probably would be okay. I would just keep watch of it. If it gets more extensive, you might consider a fungicide that's recommended, and I would check the recommendations for if she's in Rhode Island for Rhode Island, because each state may be different as far as which fungicides you can use.
Okay. Let's see. Can you tell us some names of specific fruit trees that grow well in zone 6B?
You mean cultivars, varieties, or?
Not quite sure. There wasn't specifics on that. It was a little bit earlier in the talk when that
All
question.
of the ones I mentioned can be grown in 6B.
Yes, that's what I was thinking.
The peaches, the apricots, and the Japanese plums, I would put them in a more protected location because
Okay.
they don't like a lot of cold, but all of the rest of them can be grown here.
Okay, great. Your recommendation on distance for cross-pollination that needs to happen between trees. Does that?
The trees, standard trees can be spaced fairly far apart. It's the bees, the honeybees are the ones that are going to move the pollen. So you can plant them as close as you want them to be planted. If you're looking to maybe create, with some of the dwarf trees, some people plant them closely enough together, they almost form a hedge. Or you can space them a little bit further apart because you want to maximize the number of fruits you get on them. But any standard spacing, in a standard spacing of standard full-grown trees is usually like about 10 feet apart. So in a home yard, this is probably going to be closer than that. And the bees will move the pollen, so you don't have to worry about the spacing quite so much as if it was wind pollinated.
Hardworking bees. And I think you said late winter, early spring. Beth would just like to confirm that March is an ideal time for dormant pruning.
In our area, March is starting to get a little bit warm.
Okay.
February would be better.
Okay.
And I know February is probably not your ideal time to be out in the yard working, but gee whiz, January and February, December, anytime it's dormant, when you start getting toward March with the way it's been warming here over the years, you're starting to get into some of the more active growth. It's probably not going to hurt. I mean, spring is better than fall because what pruning does is it stimulates growth, and new growth going into winter is going to be susceptible to cold damage.
Okay, that's a great tip. Beth also would just like some recommendations on when and what to use for fertilizing.
Generally, unless you have a soil test that recommends specifically you need more of the 3 basic nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium elements, I would use a balanced fertilizer that's got equal parts of each. And anything else that you might add, I would do based on a soil test.
Yeah, great. power of soil testing for sure. Let's see, Arthur would like to know when the PowerPoint will be made available somewhere else or somewhere. Arthur, it just takes us less than a week to get that up and running on YouTube. So just check back often and we will get that posted shortly. And let's see, last question is, for those with small backyard spaces that cannot plant in the ground, what are your thoughts on growing fruit trees on door fruit stock in containers?
You can grow them in containers, and there are some websites you can check out where they show them successfully being done. The big thing with them is that in the wintertime, you need to protect their roots, but you also need to let them be exposed to enough cool temperatures so that they will fruit the next year. So if you had them in your yard, for example, you would probably want to put some kind of protective insulation around the roots. You know, maybe encase them with straw or mulch so that the roots are protected as if they were in the ground. And then in the spring, you can remove them.
Okay, great. And I've answered that one. And I think just the last one, and then for time purposes, we'll probably wrap things up. But Frank wants to know how to treat brown rot on peaches.
There are fungicides you can use for that, and I would check for the latest recommendation because different products change over time. If you don't have a lot of it, I would remove the damaged fruit or leaf material, whatever you see it on, and make sure that you dispose of it, burn it, so that the spores can't be spread.
All right. Well, Bridget, we have so much positive feedback coming in. This was great. Thank you so much. We really appreciate all that you are doing. Like I mentioned before, this is now your third webinar that you have done for us. They've been really popular and they continue to be watched on YouTube. So everybody go check it out, and we hope you'll join us next week for our next session. Thank you so much, Dr. Ruemmele. We appreciate you.
You're welcome.